Our first story begins in an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a crumbling industrial town. The warehouse had once been a bustling hub of activity, filled with the sounds of machinery and workers. But now it stood silent and decaying, its windows shattered and its floors covered in dust. The locals whispered that the warehouse was cursed, that something evil lurked within its walls, but no one dared to investigate, except for a group of thrill-seekers who were drawn to the warehouse like moths to a flame. Among them was Chris, a self-proclaimed urban explorer with a love for the macabre. He had heard the stories, the dark web horror stories and Reddit scary stories that spoke of strange occurrences in the warehouse, but he dismissed them as mere legends. Armed with only a flashlight and a camera, Chris and his friends ventured into the warehouse one cold, moonless night, eager to capture footage of the eerie, abandoned space. As they entered the warehouse, the horror ambient was palpable, the air thick with an unsettling silence. The beams of their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of rusted machinery and forgotten crates. The walls, once white, were now covered in graffiti and peeling paint, the floors littered with broken glass and debris. The warehouse seemed to go on forever, its vast, empty spaces stretching into the darkness. The group began to explore, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. But as they ventured deeper into the warehouse, they started to hear strange sounds, faint whispers, the distant clanging of metal, and something that sounded like footsteps coming from the shadows. Chris's friends began to feel uneasy, but he pressed on, determined to capture something truly scary. As they reached the center of the warehouse, they found an old, rusted staircase leading down into the basement. The air grew colder as they descended, the darkness closing in around them. The basement was even more eerie than the main floor, its walls lined with rusted pipes and old, forgotten machinery, the floor slick with something they couldn't quite identify. Suddenly their flashlights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the basement with a cacophony of voices. Chris raised his camera, determined to capture whatever was causing the noise, but the camera's screen went black, as if it had been drained of power. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the basement, its back to them. It was tall and thin, its body covered in tattered clothing that hung loosely from its frame. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air grew colder and the whispers intensified, filling their minds with a sense of cosmic horror. Chris's friends began to panic, urging him to leave, but he was transfixed by the figure, unable to look away. The figure slowly turned to face them, revealing a face twisted in agony, its eyes hollow and empty. The horror ambient reached a fever pitch, the air so thick with dread that it was almost suffocating. The figure began to move toward them, its movement slow and deliberate, like something out of an analog horror film. With a final, terrified glance, Chris and his friends turned and fled, the figure's presence lingering in their minds long after they had escaped. The group turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the basement as they scrambled to escape. But as they reached the staircase, they found the entrance blocked by a heavy metal door that had slammed shut on its own. The last thing they saw before the darkness consumed them was the figure reaching out with long skeletal hands, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The next morning, the warehouse was found empty, the metal door still locked from the outside. Chris and his friends were never seen again, their fate a mystery that haunted the town for years. Our second story takes us to another abandoned warehouse, this one known as Sector 13, a massive, sprawling complex that had once been a distribution centre for a large corporation. The warehouse had been shut down abruptly, its workers laid off without explanation, and the building had been left to decay. Over the years, it became the subject of numerous dark web horror stories and paranormal investigations, with rumours of ghostly apparitions and strange occurrence. The story begins with a team of paranormal investigators who were determined to uncover the truth about Sector 13. The team was led by Jake, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for uncovering the darkest secrets of haunted locations. With him were his twin paranormal enthusiasts, Sarah and Sam, who had spent years studying the world of horror and the paranormal. As they entered the warehouse, the horror ambient was overwhelming, the air thick with a sense of dread. The building was vast, its corridors stretching on for what seemed like miles, lined with rows of empty shelves and forgotten crates. The walls were covered in graffiti, the floors littered with debris, and the ceiling dripped with moisture from the leaking roof. The team set up their equipment, cameras, EMF meters and audio recorders, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal. But as they began their investigation, strange things started to happen. The temperature in the warehouse dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the frigid air. The lights on their equipment flickered, and their cameras captured strange orbs of light that danced through the darkness. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, they began to hear strange noises, faint whispers, distant footsteps, and something that sounded like chains dragging across the floor. The horror ambient grew thicker, the air heavy with a sense of oppression. Sarah, who had always been sensitive to the paranormal, felt a growing sense of unease, as if they were being watched. Suddenly, the EMF meters spiked, and the audio recorders picked up a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the warehouse. The team froze, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, out of the shadows, they saw it. A large, shadowy figure moving toward them, its form shifting and changing as it approached. The figure was like nothing they had ever seen, a mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it, its form constantly shifting and changing. The air grew colder and the figure let out a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. The team tried to back away, but the figure moved with them, its presence suffocating. Sarah raised her camera, determined to capture the figure on film, but the camera's screen went black, the battery drained in an instant. The figure continued to advance, its form growing larger and more menacing with each step. The team could feel the air around them growing colder, the darkness closing in. In a moment of pure terror, the figure lunged at them, its form enveloping them in darkness. The last thing they heard was the sound of chains rattling, followed by a deafening silence. The next morning, the warehouse was found empty, their equipment scattered across the floor, but the team was gone. Their disappearance became the stuff of legends, the subject of countless scary true stories and horror recaps. The warehouse, now known as Sector 13, was sealed off, but those who dared to venture too close claimed they could hear the sound of chains dragging across the floor and the low, rumbling growl of the shadowy figure that still haunted the building. Our final story takes us to yet another abandoned warehouse, this one located in the heart of a long-forgotten industrial district. The warehouse had been abandoned for decades, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered, and its floors covered in dust and debris. The building was rumoured to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died within its walls. Workers who had been trapped in a fire that had consumed the building years ago. The story begins with a group of amateur ghost hunters who had heard the rumors and decided to explore the warehouse for themselves. They were led by Mike, a horror enthusiast with a passion for exploring the unknown. With him were his friends Jenna and Ryan, who shared his fascination with the paranormal. As they entered the warehouse, the horror ambient was immediate, the air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. The building was vast, its corridors lined with rusted machinery and forgotten crates. The walls were covered in soot and graffiti, the floors littered with broken glass and debris. The warehouse seemed to go on forever, its vast, empty spaces stretching into the darkness. The group began to explore, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. But as they ventured deeper into the warehouse, they started to hear strange sounds, faint whispers, the distant clanging of metal, and something that sounded like footsteps coming from the shadows. The horror ambience grew thicker, the sense of dread more intense. Jenna, who had always been sensitive to the paranormal, began to feel uneasy, as if they were being watched. As they reached the heart of the warehouse, they found an old rusted door that led to the basement. The air grew colder as they descended, the darkness closing in around them. The basement was even more eerie than the main floor, its walls lined with rusted pipes and old forgotten machinery, the floor slick with something they couldn't quite identify. Suddenly, their flashlights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the basement with a cacophony of voices. Mike raised his camera, determined to capture whatever was causing the noise, but the camera's screen went black, as if it had been drained of power. Then they saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their forms twisted and deformed, their eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The figures moved slowly toward them, their movements jerky and unnatural, like something out of a Batman analog horror film. The horror ambience reached a fever pitch, the air so thick with dread that it was almost suffocating. The group tried to run, but the basement was a maze of corridors and dead ends, the walls closing in around them. The figures continued to advance, their eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The group could feel the air around them growing colder, the darkness closing in. In a moment of pure terror, the figures lunged at them, their forms enveloping them in darkness. The last thing they heard was the sound of chains rattling, followed by a deafening silence. The next morning, the warehouse was found empty, their equipment scattered across the floor, but the group was gone. Their disappearance became the stuff of legends, the subject of countless dark web horror stories and Reddit scary stories. The warehouse, now known as the place of the forgotten ones, was sealed off. But those who dared to venture too close claimed they could hear the sound of chains rattling and the low, rumbling growl of the figures that still haunted the building.